Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars from the day, I hope. My name is Dr. Alistair Ford. I'm a senior lecturer at Newcastle University. I'm not Kristen McCaskill, who was meant to be hosting today, but she's unwell and unable to join us, so I'm standing in. Hopefully it will go just as smoothly with me in the chair. For those who may not be familiar with DARE, DARE is our national hub for decarbonised, adaptable and resilient transport infrastructure, bringing together a range of UK stakeholders from industry, government, civic partners and academia to help us explore viable future pathways and solutions for a transition to a resilient and decarbonised transport system for the UK. We are funded by UKRI, EPSRC and the Department for Transport, and our research team includes the universities of Newcastle, Cambridge, Glasgow, Heriot-Watt and Anglia Ruskin. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore how transport sectors are working to assess and evaluate their resilience to climate change. How do we understand what our current resilience is, what our future resilience might be, and how we adapt in order to improve that resilience at the same time as tackling the challenge of decarbonisation. So we'll hear from two speakers today. We'll have questions for clarification immediately following each presentation, and then a broader discussion about this world of resilience in the transport system towards the end of the webinar. If you do have any questions or queries, please submit them via the chat or raise your hand after the presentations if you'd like to ask your question verbally. Okay, so without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today's webinar, who is Dr. Katherine Drayson. Katherine is Senior Environment Manager at Transport for London, leading TfL's strategic work on green infrastructure and climate change adaptation. Katherine was formerly a member of the GLA's environment team, focused on the development and production of the groundbreaking London Environment Strategy, as well as managing green infrastructure and climate change adaptation projects and programmes. She previously worked as an Environment and Energy Research Fellow at a leading UK think tank, where she authored 2 policy reports on urban green spaces, which resulted in a key recommendation being adopted and implemented by government, as well as co-authoring a report on onshore wind policy. Katherine is also a finalist for the UK Women in Green Business Awards for Nature Professional of the Year. Congratulations on that. So over to you, Katherine. 15 minutes or so, if you please, and then we'll take a few questions from your presentation before moving on to our second speaker.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali. Just confirm you can see the presentation?
Yes, we can indeed. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I was asked today to speak about how TfL adapts to climate change. Before I go into that, I think it's sensible to give a little bit of background on what TfL is. So Transport for London is one of the world's largest integrated transport authorities, and we have a finger in just about every London-related transport pie. And this slide, I don't expect you to read all of it, but it does give you an overview and a high-level impression of just how many assets we have, the complexity of our networks, and the reach that we have across the UK and beyond through our supply chain. So today I was asked to talk about the work that we're doing on adapting to climate change. And this is just a vastly simplified diagram of the journey that we're on. Today I'm going to speak about every step except monitoring. I've put monitoring on here because it's critically important, but truthfully, we're quite a long way off figuring out how to do this cost effectively, both within TfL and collaboratively, because for a lot of these for a lot of adaptation measures, at least in terms of assessing resilience, a collaborative effort is likely to be required. So today I'm going to start with risk, then how we manage that risk and the challenges that we face across both those elements. So how do we measure risk? All transport sector organisations have a long history of assessing risk in general, and also of responding to severe weather events. This is not new to us. But what is relatively new is combining those two elements together. So assessing how weather affects our people, our assets, our services, and then combining that with climate projections data to quantify future risk. TfL has responded to DEFRA under each round of their adaptation reporting power. For those of you who don't know, this is currently a voluntary initiative under the Climate Change Act. It's supposed to be reported on under roughly a 5-year cycle to inform the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and National Adaptation Programme. And last year, we included more parts of the business than ever before, and we added new risks based on the severe weather events that we had experienced since 2021, particularly the 2022 heat wave. So whilst the overall number of risks has increased from 333 in the 2021 reporting round to 477 in last year's reporting round, it's not because our climate risk profile has changed. It's more that we better understand our risks. So the overall message remains the same. All parts of our business are already or will be affected by climate change, and impacts will increase in severity over time. On top of that, the climate hazard with the greatest number of risks is precipitation, so both too much and too little, followed by temperature, too high, too low, and also large diurnal temperature swings. But we know that climate hazards don't respect organisational boundaries. So we can't just look at TfL's climate risks in isolation. We need to work across sectors to ensure our resilience. And it's not only climate hazards that don't respect operational boundaries, it's also the fact that we rely on others to be able to operate. So last year we worked with key transport sector stakeholders, including Network Rail, National Highways, HS1, HS2, DFT, DEFRA, and the Office for Rail and Road, together with the expertise of Mott MacDonald, to shift the dial in our understanding of interdependencies for London's road and rail sector. So that's beyond just TfL's remit. That was the entirety of London's road and rail sector. Previously, most work on this topic had resulted in sort of mind maps or spider diagrams with arrows showing the relationships across the sectors. And some, for example, Network Rails, even attempted to assess the relative importance of the interdependency with weighted arrows of different sizes. But this work broke new ground. For the first time, it characterised the impact pathway and scored the risks. And this was all done through workshops with stakeholders across all of the different sectors. There's still a lot more work to be done in this space, including adding a spatial component. But as you can see from the diagram, there's nothing particularly novel in terms of the results. What was novel was the methodology used to better understand the risks. What we found was that surface water flooding, high temperatures and heat waves, and winds and storms tends to be the biggest issues for London, and the usual suspects in terms of the kind of upstream sectors were involved, particularly power and drainage and water supply. Now, our work on climate risks and our interdependencies included a relatively straightforward assessment of future risk, assuming no adaptation measures and just continuation of business as usual activities. It's important to say this is all qualitative. However, mandatory reporting under the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has now been rolled into ISSB, now requires consideration of how risks would change across a range of different scenarios. So not just in terms of different emission scenarios, but more broadly. But interestingly, it leaves the development of those scenarios and the decision on which risks to assess up to the individual organisation. So working with teams across the business, we developed 4 scenarios that aligned with some that TfL had developed for transport planning work. So really important for us that we had some coherence across the 2 sets of scenarios. And we also identified 7 high-level risks to assess against each scenario, 2 of which were acute physical risks that we knew from our adaptation reporting power work were particularly challenging for us. The work we've done to actually assess those risks against the scenarios will be published in our annual report this summer, but it's fair to say that, again, we weren't able to quantify the risks in the way that we hoped to because of the very limited data on how our assets respond to severe weather now. Now that we have a good qualitative overview of TfL's climate risks, what do we do to manage them? This is the million-dollar question. Or what would you do with the $1 million to adapt TfL's networks to climate change? To climate change. So the major initiative and kind of step forward that TfL has taken is the publication of TfL's first adaptation plan. This was 2 years ago. And what was really important here is that we're still very much in the foundational stage of our adaptation journey. So the plan focuses heavily on training, on data, on embedding considerations of climate risk and adaptation into TfL's processes. If I'm brutally honest with myself, it's probably not very inspiring stuff for most people, though of course I find it scintillating. But what was potentially more inspiring for the layperson was the inclusion of TfL's first ever corporate sustainable drainage system, or SUDS, target. And this is really important because in the absence of quantitative climate risk assessments and a quantitative business case for potentially quite costly adaptation measures, we're focusing our on-the-ground adaptation efforts in the short term on low or no regrets options. And those at the moment are nature-based solutions. So this slide gives you a quick overview of some of these SUDS and solutions that we've implemented over the past couple of years. Now, our adaptation plan includes a commitment to deliver 5,000 square metres of additional catchment draining into highways-based SUDS each year. And it's important that it's highways because this was actually the TfL component of a broader London-wide transport target in the Mayor's transport strategy. I'm pleased to say that we met the first year of our target and we exceeded it so well that we decided to really push ourselves. So for our 2024-25 corporate scorecard, and now the scorecard includes a range of targets across topics from customer, finance, colleague, safety and green. For the first time ever, we included a SUDS target. This is really important because the scorecard is linked to senior manager remuneration. So the target had included a floor target, so that was the 5,000 square metres that was in the adaptation plan, but also a stretch target of 9,000 square metres of catchment delivered across our entire estate. And I'm very pleased to say that we've met both of those targets this year. But it's not all plain sailing, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yes, we've made a lot of progress on improving our strategies, our plans, and project management processes over the last few years. But other than SUDS, there hasn't been a lot of change on the ground. And that's down to several different reasons. First, I want to start with the external context that we can't really do that much about within Transport for London, and that is increasing urbanisation. And now that increases our exposure to both surface water flooding because there's less permeable land, and also the urban heat island effect. Then the fact that we have ageing infrastructure. I mean, parts of London Underground are over 160 years old, and over time it's only going to become more vulnerable to climate-related impacts. And this is, of course, closely linked with the resource challenge, which I'm not going to go into detail on because everyone's experiencing it. This is nothing new. Knowledge and senior level buy-in all form part of the sort of culture change that we're attempting to achieve over the next couple of years with our adaptation, green infrastructure and biodiversity training course, which will be rolled out later this year, as well as our operations environment awareness training, which is already being rolled out. Political buy-in is a long-standing issue, and that is closely linked with the next category of challenges that I want to focus on a little bit more in detail. So that's data. To fight for our share of resource allocation, and it is a fight at the moment, we need the data to demonstrate what the business case for investing in adaptation is. And right now, we can't do that very well. In most cases, we don't have the quantitative data to show how weather affects our operations and people now. But even for those assets where we do have quantitative data, and I'd like to shout out Dr. Sarah Greenham for the work that she's done with us on points assets. So we have quantitative data for that. But the Met Office hasn't provided their UK CP18, the climate projections data, in a way that's usable for the infrastructure sector to use. So we can't actually project forward very easily at all. What we need is the frequencies of different threshold exceedances over different time periods and under different emission scenarios. But 6 years on from publication, we unfortunately still don't have that. But it is probably the easiest data gap that we currently have for academia to fill. So I'd like to end this presentation with a bit of a challenge to the DARE Hub. Is this a critical data gap? Is this critical data gap something that can be filled through this work programme going forward? And I'll leave it at that. And I believe it's clarification questions now and more detailed questions later. But I will circulate the slides. I'm sure the slides can be circulated in case anybody's interested. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katherine. Perfect framing for the discussions today, and thanks for the challenge. Maybe that's something we can have a chat about as we build our DARE approach and modelling frameworks to bring some of that data in, hopefully. So we've got a question about the SUDS aspect of your work. So I think we could probably pick that up now because that's quite a specific kind of question about TfL and London, and then maybe there's one other hand up, and then we can move on to the second presentation, I think more broadly. So if we go to Hugh's question first, Hugh's asking if you've been able to coordinate your SUDS implementation on TfL managed roads with complementary implementation on roads that you aren't in control of. And I mean, I would ask a supplementary question of what about non-road SUDS? Are you able to get SUDS in places that might reduce the impact on your road network, but where those SUDS aren't located on roads as well? So if you could pick up that question first, thank you.
Of course, really happy to, and this is a topic close to my heart. I think in terms of Hugh's question, with regard to the coordination, I would say imperfectly, though that is starting to improve over time. So when TfL develops, for example, a cycle scheme, that is largely on borough roads, and we're now shifting more towards the installation of permeable paving and other SUDS measures across those schemes. So that's starting to become, I'd love to say it's business as usual, but I think it's more we're getting to that point, which is really encouraging. On top of that, TfL administers government funding to the boroughs for highways improvement schemes through something called local implementation plan funding. And we develop guidance around what kinds of schemes we would expect to be developed using that funding, and then the boroughs can bid for that. Within that guidance, we do strongly recommend the integration of sustainable drainage systems. So that is starting to weave through. But I would say a lot of the boroughs are further ahead than we are on this. So, for example, Enfield, Ian Russell and his team have been doing incredible work on SUDS across the borough. One really good initiative that's happening at the moment is the development of the London Surface Water Strategic Group, which was convened following the July 2021 flood events. And as part of that, we're going to be publishing this year London's first ever city-wide surface water strategy, which is really exciting because the number of risk management authorities across London with legal responsibilities for surface water flooding is enormous. It's all of the boroughs twice over. There's three local flood authorities and highways authorities, plus TfL, Thames Water, Environment Agency. So you get the picture, it's very complicated. So we need one strategy that brings everyone together. And as part of that, we're developing SUDS opportunity modelling, which sets out where across the city we can spend our limited funding for the greatest possible flood risk reduction. Once we have that, hopefully later this year, we should be able to better coordinate our efforts, particularly as part of the catchment partnerships that are being proposed as part of the strategy. And then off the roads, yes, green roofs, etc. Yes, that's all being included. The 9,000 square metre stretch target is across our entire estate, not just highways.
Yeah, and this is something we're thinking about in DARE. You've also raised urbanisation. That's another question. When we're looking at 2050 or 2080, how might things have changed in terms of permeable surfaces, etc. But we could pick some of these things up later. So one other question, I'll go to Tawhida, is it?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Thank you, Katherine. Very, very useful presentation to know. And I echo your challenges with the data, because we've tried to, from a Midlands Connect perspective, get that data and project it as well, and it hasn't been easy in terms of the climate projections. But I'm also interested in finding out, how did you manage to map out the asset data and their associated risks and overcoming those challenges?
Well, we've only done it for one. It's a brilliant question. We've only done it for one asset category quantitatively, and that's points assets. So we actually used work orders. I don't know if Sarah Greenham's on the call, but I'm sure she'd be willing to provide more detail on that one, because she was the one who actually did the work. But yeah, it's not easy. And the great thing that she developed was being able to produce effectively a heat map showing where our points assets are across our estate, against their vulnerability, based on the timing of the work orders and the temperatures at which those work orders were raised. So we have a better understanding of at what temperature thresholds they're likely to fail. And so based on that, we can start doing the cost benefit business case for, is it worth us replacing this particular point signal in comparison with leaving it be and having service disruption. But yes, it's not easy. That took about 3 years.
Okay.
But now that we have the methodology, we're looking to expand it out to other asset categories.
Right. Is there a way of sharing the best practices and lessons learned with everyone else through this?
Yes, I think there is. Certainly there are publications already out there and in the pipeline, and Sarah's PhD is published on the University of Birmingham website. Once I've stopped talking, I will start putting links in the chat.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks for your question as well. And this is something we're picking up in Dare, is trying to build that kind of understanding across hazards and across modes. What are the critical thresholds for temperature, water level, whatever, and how do we start to get the data that allows us to simulate some of those things through our modelling. So we'll pick all of this discussion up. Hopefully there's lots of questions in the chat that we'll come back to once we've heard from our second speaker. So we've obviously fired off a lot of thoughts, Katherine. So thank you for getting us underway. So if I can now give Katherine a rest and move over to our second speaker, Stephen, who's hopefully just about ready to go whilst I introduce Stephen. So Stephen is the Technical Director for Climate Futures, Climate Resilience at AtkinsRéalis. He's an applied climate scientist and hydrologist working on climate change in the UK and internationally. His work in the transport sector includes national risk assessment for Transport Scotland and climate assurance work for HS2. He has been empanelled, that's a new word for me, he's been an empanelled climate change and transport consultant at the Asian Development Bank for more than a decade, which has included work on reconstruction of Pakistan's national road network following the 2020 floods, as well as studies across Asia and the Pacific in some of the most hazardous and challenging environments in the world. He has made significant contributions to UK national climate change risk assessment, including CCRA1 at HR Wallingford, and developing the H++ scenarios for CCRA2 whilst at the Met Office. So again, great set of credentials for talking about the topic we're exploring today. So if you're ready, Stephen, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I started my career quite a long time ago now, and it was studying the impacts of climate change and landslides. And at the time, we felt that hydrological impacts in particular was something we'd see in future, perhaps in the 2050s. That's clearly not the case, and we need resilience, right now. I just really want to get across the urgency of more action in this space on transport networks in the UK and globally. What I'm going to try and do in my 15 minutes is give a really quick introduction to our approach to climate risk assessment at AtkinsRéalis, then talk about the Transport Scotland work that we did in 2023 and 2024, and then hopefully land seamlessly onto the webinar themes and just to reflect on 7 learning points from the Transport Scotland work that I think are really relevant for DARE and other similar projects. So first of all, our approach at AtkinsRéalis, and I think this is a horribly busy slide, which I'm going to apologise for in advance. but it touches on some of the things that the previous speaker was talking about. So, I mean, we adopt the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Risk Framework, so we're always looking at hazard, vulnerability and exposure. As engineers, we also take a strong engineering perspective, looking at probability and consequences of events, and we're always trying to quantify as much as possible in our work. I guess I benefited my team. We've got a number of meteorologists and applied climate scientists, and a lot of data scientists. So we make a lot of use of data from the UK Met Office, but also ECMWF and other services. And we always make use of a wide range of scenarios in our work. So always making sure we cover at least the range of warming from 2 to 4 degrees in the long term. Strong engagement essential in all of our work, and more we're doing sort of multi-hazard analysis, and sort of more complicated things, combining a number of different data sets together. So yeah, we picked up some work for Transport Scotland in 2023. This was working towards their vision of a transport system which is well adapted and prepared for current and future impacts of climate change, safe for all users, reliable for everyday journeys, and resilient to weather-related disruption. And that comes from their approach and kind of vision document, which is quoted below there. And it was a key action that they should produce an adaptation plan for their trunk roads as part of the Scottish National Adaptation Programme, which was a key driver for our work. And our approach to this, always very focused on their desired outcome, followed the kind of standard UK SIP kind of risk framework as shown here, with a sort of problem definition, a climate screening step, climate risk assessment, adaptation planning and monitoring. I think the key point here is that we were tasked with doing this really very quickly. Most of the work was done in a 6-month period, and it was essential that at every stage there's really strong engagement with a whole range of departments across Transport Scotland. So it was very heavily dependent on workshops and sharing data throughout to make sure that we got what we needed, and to make sure that we could truly kind of validate our risk assessment and get buy-in for the things we were putting forward in the adaptation plan. A quick thing to say here is that we developed a web GIS as part of the project, which was maintained to demonstrate the results of the risk screening and also the risk assessment. And what that meant, which turned out to be really useful, was that everyone could actually see the risk assessment as it developed and drill in and look at the data, look at how we were scoring things. And when it came to our workshops, they were kind of participatory workshops that could actually see the web GIS online, and we could discuss things in detail. So I think that was a really powerful thing during this project. The problem definition step in the kind of UK SIP framework is often seen as a quick step and skipped over quickly, but this is really, really important to set out the parameters of any risk assessment and adaptation plan at the beginning of a project. For us, it meant that we were really clear on the importance of the trunk road network as lifeline infrastructure that was connecting major urban centres, airports, seaports and towns, and facilitating the Scottish economy. The value of the asset base is around 28 billion, or it was valued as that in 2023, with 3.1 million motor vehicles licensed for use across Scotland. And it was clear to us that it was imperative to understand exactly where and how badly affected the network was by climate change in order to develop and implemented very targeted adaptation and resilience measures. And at this stage, we started to agree things like what data we were going to use, what climate scenarios would be incorporated into the assessment, and quite how we would engage stakeholders through the project. And it's really essential to get that clear up front. So then we moved to a baseline screening stage, and for this we looked at 8 hazards combined with asset data, which described the criticality of system links for the entire network. And we also brought in this concept of remoteness across Scotland. So here we're going back to the IPCC framework, looking at hazard exposure and vulnerability, and we were using a scoring approach. And that was done at the scale of this hex mapping, which is shown in the middle here, that tracks the road network. And we deliberately looked at the network itself and the assets within these areas and the kind of environments and neighborhoods around the road network. And this was done using a range of data, and a key learning point here is getting your kind of data and your workflow set up really well in the beginning of a project like this. We assimilated all the relevant data from Transport Scotland, brought in various strands of UK CP18 evidence, but also, in this step, we assimilated all of the SEPA flood maps, as well as elevation models and some of the free data from BGS. So this was all brought into the system, and the outcome of this was an initial climate risk kind of screening that highlighted surface water flooding, landslides and river flooding as the top issues, followed by river scour, coastal flooding, cold snaps and high winds, with warm days, as we might expect, being a bit lower down the list for Scotland than may be for London and TfL. So then we kind of move into the step, which is, is my main core area in terms of how to do risk assessment. We used UK climate change projections, and we used almost all sources of all products from the UK CP18 range to bring into this analysis. And what we did for all of the medium and high risks, in fact, we did this for temperature as well, we identified key thresholds of interest to Transport Scotland, and we developed analysis that was based on the frequency of exceedance. So we did a lot of frequency analysis, we did some extreme value analysis, and we came up with lots of maps like this on the right. So this is an example, which is the number of days meeting our landslide threshold annually in the 2050s for RCP6. The scale's a bit odd because we're talking about a 20-year time period here, but essentially anywhere that's red or pink, you've got at least, from sort of 1 landslide risk day a year up to sort of 5 days a year, where you may have a landslide that would block a major road. And some key learning points here really is that you don't really get what you want from just one UK CP product. You've got to develop time series for some indicators. You need to use a whole range of information. We worked with regional climate models at 12 kilometres and the UK CP local as well. We used observed data on a 5-kilometre grid from Met Office, and we also used the probabilistic data. We developed a lot of multivariate indicators like you see here. So this landslide indicator combines both the antecedent rainfall over a time period plus heavy rainfall on the day. So it's two precipitation variables together. And many of our indices combine more than one climate variable. And when we started looking at probability and consequences, looking at the risks, we very much adopt what we call an assessment hierarchy. And that means that we look at the damage to assets, and we've used depth damage functions for flooding, for example, but we also look at the network and we look at the impact on services. And I guess I'll give a nod there to sort of Newcastle, Oxford and others. That idea about a hierarchy for risk assessment and kind of a systems thinking approach does come from previous work at Newcastle and Oxford over the years. But that's really essential, because without it, you probably underestimate the consequences by a factor of 10. And if you're trying to do business cases, you want to understand the full range of consequences of climate change. And then a final learning point from the risk assessment side is that validation of any risk assessment against incident data and through engagement is really, really important. And this is where we managed to get some data from Transport Scotland and road operators. We could display it on the GIS. We could compare it to our scoring and our damage estimates and get basically buy-in that our risk assessment was on the right track. And data for validation is a key aspect of all of this work. What we came up with overall in the final risk assessment was this ranking of risks. So the highest risks for us were surface water flooding, river flooding, landslides, and actually river scour through engagement with Transport Scotland was elevated to a higher risk class. River scour wasn't something we managed to really model in detail. It's a bit more complex. But following that, coastal flooding, heavy snowfall and sort of cold snaps, cascading failures, and then high winds and increasing temperatures. So this was the order of risks following the detailed risk assessment. In terms of adaptation planning, this work was led by my colleague Lucas Everett, and what we did to sort of meet the vision of a well-adapted transport system, we came up with a very wide range of adaptation and resilience measures, and they were kind of organized in terms of themes, these trap action themes, a safe network, a reliable network, a resilient network, and under each of these there are a whole range of recommendations. But also the plan came up with a lot of enabler themes that would enable Transport Scotland and their partners to deliver resilience going forward. And those things were generally around engagement and partnership with SEPA, Network Rail, other people with an interest in Scotland. Some more work on research and understanding to fill the gaps that we were unable to deal with in our assessment, and a lot of work on monitoring and evaluation. And I think the learning point for us here is to really make sure that when we're talking about resilience and doing things both now and to deal with climate change in the future, it's really going to be a wide range of different measures that you need to get into your plan. Everything from diversion, route planning, contingency planning, through to digitalization of your asset data and coming up with more sophisticated asset management tools. And I'm not going to haven't got time to go through this in detail, but these are the kinds of examples of some of the adaptation recommendations. So I mentioned diversion planning, but improving diversion planning for local road networks. Lots more work on improving the disruption risk register and incident database for future work, and a lot of work on things like adaptation pathways going forward. To leave time for questions, just reflecting for a moment. I mean, this was a really enjoyable study for the team. It was done very quickly, but we think we made lots of advances in both our risk assessment methods and in adaptation planning methods as part of this. But just to really then come back to those 7 learning points, which I touched on during the slides. I think most of these are very relevant in terms of methods for evaluating climate risk and resilience in transport systems. In terms of practical interventions, it's essential to include a wide range of measures in the plan. And I think I'm particularly interested in this case, in this issue that was raised also by the previous speaker about getting information for business cases. It's really challenging to develop some strong business cases, and I think you really need as quantitative as possible, but a really good risk assessment. you need to have really good validation against incident data, and it's only if you bring all that together could you develop a really strong case for further investment in resilience and adaptation. I'll stop there, Alistair. I was having some issues with my screen. I hope it did come through okay. I can't see this on the web version of Zoom.
Perfect.
But over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, well, it looked fine for me. Hopefully it did for everyone else. So no worries on that front. And you know, as someone who teaches GIS, it's nice to know that it's useful sometimes as well in these processes. So thank you to both our speakers for their excellent framing presentations. They've really given us a lot of food for thought, and there's been a lot of questions already in the chat. So I'm going to try my best. You might have to help me with this, Livia, to get through as many of these as I can. So I think one that's come out for both presentations really was if you could just stop sharing, Stephen, then we can all, yeah, great, we can see each other, I think. So I'll pick up a question that merges a few of these things together. There's a few questions about different types of adaptation. So you talked about SUDS, Katherine, in your talk, and green interventions. But someone's asked about more kind of soft adaptation, so information, early warning, quick recovery, etc. So how do you balance the different types of adaptation options, the green versus grey, the hard versus soft, and is there a way that we can quantify the benefits of these different types of adaptations, including co-benefits, in order to prioritize what's the most appropriate way to adapt our systems? Is there any thoughts you can?
Oh gosh,
maybe
that's
go to you first, Katherine.
That's a big question.
I mean, is it mainly that we're looking at kind of hard interventions in this space still, or are we starting to think about the soft adaptations too?
We're actually focusing more on the sort of procedural, strategic, process kind of based interventions at the moment because of the data gap. We don't currently have the data to show how our assets and our people respond to different kinds of weather, then combine that with the climate projections to figure out how that will change in the future, and then develop a business case and evidence-based business case around what interventions will be most cost effective for the business. In the absence of that data, if you gave me £50 million tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to tell you how to most cost effectively spend that from an adaptation perspective because we don't have the data. So in the meantime, that's why we're trying to prioritize so much fixing the data gap, making sure that climate risk and adaptation training and awareness is there across the business, trying to make sure that our senior leadership is aware of the potential future impacts and implications of not adapting to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Those are really key areas of work for us. Over time, as the data gap is reduced, I'm anticipating that we will see more of a shift and an emphasis on the ground interventions. Well, I certainly hope so anyway. So for the time being, it's very much sort of foundational work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to plug for DARE, this is one of the things we're trying to think about with our modelling framework is how do we quantify the benefits of softer interventions. So the reason we use an agent-based modelling is that we can start to hopefully understand the responses of people in the system and test out these different types of adaptation options. Can I come to you, Stephen? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I guess in terms of types of adaptation options, I mean, I always use a sort of adaptation typologies and things, whether they're from the Climate Change Committee or the international literature, to make sure, almost as a checklist, to make sure we're capturing all the things that are, I guess, well evidenced as good adaptation measures. I think for always in our adaptation work now, nature-based solutions, natural flood management are always being heavily promoted. And if there's a case that they're going to work effectively, if it's the right solution in the right place, then they'll always be sort of elevated, I think, in terms of being sort of cost effective and promoted in adaptation plans. And we did highlight some of those issues, for example, managing runoff in a catchment to stop runoff going on a road, and the need for Transport Scotland to work with other partners to deliver those kinds of schemes. That was part of the plan. But I'll stop there because I think you've got some hands up. I can see John's hand up there.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. And again, it's interesting, how we quantify all of these things as a challenge we're grappling with at the minute. I mean, we've got an adaptation inventory for a previous project, but I don't know whether we have an adaptation inventory of things that work and of things that have been tested for the transport sector that we could share across different operators. So, John, do you want to jump in with your question now?
Yeah, I'm acutely mindful that I've got other fora to talk about this, and that is I chair the UK Adaptation Biodiversity Climate Board for all of UK highways, all 214, which does include Transport Scotland. It does include TfL, and I think it's worth noting that the work that TfL is doing on its network is absolutely fantastic. I think there is a couple of points really starting on the data side, and it does link in. And I note Dr. Hugh Deeming is on the call because across all authorities, the 3 devolved administrations and DFT, there was a major review undertaken in 2021, which Dr. Deeming did, and also a retrospective that he's just undertaken, showing really the health of the nation or health of highway authorities in picking up this issue of adaptation. And specifically, I'm talking about adaptation, not decarbonisation. Okay, so I guess the context is this data gap, this lack of insight, the reference to an agent-based model, the reference to what's been appointed in DFT by TfL. Stephen, your excellent work and that of your colleague Simon Shapcott and others across Atkins is really good, relating to Transport Scotland and others. But WSP did work for Network Rail in Scotland. We've got a range of different consultants, a different set of models coming through, some great work from Transport for West Midlands. How, as clients, can we understand what are those different models that are out there? And if we are fortunate in having a bit of money to spare to invest in this space and an intelligent client to lead it, how do we actually approach the market in a meaningful way to support the communities and the assets that connect them?
Another big question. Who wants to pick that one up? Katherine, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah, trying to find the raise hands button on Zoom is beyond me today. So I'm used to Teams. On this one, I think the key is talking. I don't think that there is going to be a nifty sort of digital solution to being able to assess all of these different approaches and models, etc. It's going to take too long to populate, and we don't have the time. There are existing fora that allow for those kinds of conversations to happen. So, for example, the Infrastructure Operators Adaptation Forum, another mouthful, the Transport Adaptation Steering Group, which is London focused, etc., etc. And certainly the rail sector in particular has really come together over the past, I'd say, 5 years in particular, on adaptation specifically, and we talk all the time. So I think that we're getting better in that space. Highways is much more fragmented, and I think there's still some work to be done there.
And if I can come
Sorry,
in,
go on,
I mentioned that I think work between sort of practitioners and researchers and client organizations is really important. I think there's a number of consultants working in this space. I mean, they will have some sort of methods they might like to use and be proprietary, but our point of view, certainly in the climate change team, is we're very open about what we do, and we publish a lot of our code. We're really keen to work with the research community and others in this space. And we are doing quite a lot of relevant stuff for transport, for example, with the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and we'll be developing open source products over the next sort of year or so. So watch this space.
Great. And Dare, we are here to be the national hub. We're meant to be a kind of place for people to meet and converse and share. So if there's anything we can do in terms of workshops or events that might be able to facilitate some of these conversations and some of that sharing, then please do let us know, and we'll try our best to build those kinds of things into our program. There's another couple of questions about quantifying impacts, quantifying risks. So I think, Stephen, you mentioned the kind of direct versus indirect. If we don't quantify the indirect impacts of these events, then we're missing a big part of the actual cost of this. So how much work is going on that kind of quantification, whether it is financial or in other means, through as I think it's Amber's asked the question there about, through other lenses like financial, legal, health, all of the other potential co-benefits. So could you pick that one up, maybe, Stephen, or to start with?
Yeah, sure. So in our work, in our framework, we really emphasize the indirect consequences. We managed to quantify the direct ones, and then our other analysis was a little bit more qualitative, given the time we had on our project. However, we kind of recommended the kind of modelling and the information required to do that more detailed assessment. So for us, we pushed it into the adaptation plan and recommended that these things were done. And clearly, some of that work, you know, the university sector has tools which could, you know, can help with that. I don't know about your agent-based modelling, for example, but if you are, you know, if you want to model traffic flows and the impacts, you can do that. But there's lots of other things you can do as well. So we started making some recommendations in that space, and then sort of separate from this, we have also, you know, we are developing predictive analytics type platforms for asset management. That's another area. So if you want to understand the impact on assets and other things, there are, you know, there are tools under development which some people are taking up, which may be of interest.
Yeah, I mean, our agent-based modelling is trying to get into that space of quantifying some of the indirect impacts and thinking about who gets affected by these events. I'm very conscious that we're rapidly running out of time, which is very frustrating because there's loads of things to ask. But I think there's a bigger question again in some of the comments about, so the adaptation or the risk assessments and the adaptation plans that you both presented, are they assessing the current day transport network and current day transport demands under future climate? So how much do the future networks come into this? You know, assuming a decarbonised transport system, population growth, all of the other things that will affect the transport system, do they feed into that risk assessment, or are we looking at 2025's network with 2050's climate?
Only in the narrative for me. So yeah, qualitatively, yes, these issues are mentioned. I mean, you might have very different exposures and vulnerabilities if you've got a more electric infrastructure. But for our study, I have to say, you know, we looked at today's trunk road network and we looked at the impact of climate change on that in future. We didn't model future traffic demand. We didn't start adding assets because of transition. So yeah, all very interesting stuff to do.
That's why we're here. And Katherine, over to you on that one as well.
Very, very similar. So for the climate risk assessment under the adaptation reporting power, we just looked at our existing network projecting forward to the future. Just a linear projection under a particular climate emission scenario. For the TCFD reporting, we developed those different scenarios, which were a little bit broader, but they're so, again, high level. It's you can't predict necessarily what the transport network is going to look like under any one of those scenarios particularly well, because if we could, crystal ball would be a fine thing. But generally speaking, I would say newer assets tend to be less vulnerable, better adapted to climate change going forward. So I'm slightly less concerned about the asset response to new asset response to climate change. I'm more concerned about interdependencies. That's more the issue for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we're grappling with in DARE is, you know, if you decarbonise by electrification, what does that do to the risk on the network? If you decarbonise by a big shift to active travel, you know, does it make you more or less resilient than you are currently? And I don't think we know the answers to those questions at the minute. So there was one other question that you already kind of answered in the chat, Katherine, about prioritisation of adaptation measures and identifying important assets. Could you expand on that a little bit? How do you identify the places where adaptation is most important on a network scale, or is that still a work in progress too?
It's still very much work in progress. I mean, we've done it at asset category level for our climate risk assessment. So we know roughly which categories of assets tend to be the most vulnerable to climate change related impacts going forward. What we don't have at the moment is that spatial dimension, with the exception of something called Lucifer, which is the best acronym. It used to stand for the London Underground Comprehensive Review of Flood Risk, so LUCRFR. But now they're expanding that out beyond underground to be just London Comprehensive Review of Flood Risk, to include other TfL transport-related assets. That has developed a quantitative assessment of our flood risk from almost all sources. It doesn't include reservoirs, but the two key flood risk related hazards are pluvial and burst water mains. So that has provided us with some very full of assumptions, quantitative assessment of business related risk. So,
okay, right. I think we've got 1 minute left, so I should probably wrap up and let people get on with their next appointments. So I think it just remains to say thank you very much to both Katherine and Stephen for stepping in to present today two very, very relevant case studies on the work that you're doing, and I think lots of follow-up conversations to be had with the DARE team and others. So hopefully those who have put questions in the chat can connect up. The recording of this will be on our YouTube channel soon. And thanks to everyone who attended today and asked such excellent questions. It was a really informative session, and it's great to see some familiar and some new faces. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursdays.